Recording. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the OHMM webinar session. This is the second of our Toolkit webinars today, May 12th. And I'm your host. My name is Kim Welter. I use she, her pronouns. I am the facilitator of the OHMM Coalition, and I will be in the background kind of teching things, I guess, for lack of a better word. But I did want to make sure that everybody realizes that we are recording this. If by chance you don't want to be recorded, then I give you the option to do whatever it is that you need to do. I do want to announce that this is the first in a series. There will be one webinar each month, so watch for those future webinars. The next one will be June 9th, and it will be a webinar geared towards caseworkers and people living with, and we are currently working to secure the ability to give CEUs to folks who attend that webinar. So with all of that said, I do want to turn this over to Zach first to introduce himself, and to our other presenter, Jerry, who will follow, I believe. Zach?
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon and for your work in this fight as well. My name is Zach McCune. I use he, him pronouns, and I am the Advocacy Manager for Equitas Health. We are excited to have you all here today to participate virtually in what we think will be a very productive session about our efforts, the coalition's efforts to modernize the laws here in Ohio, and how you can take matters into your own hands and be an advocate for this community and this coalition in front of policymakers.
I'm Jerry Malacote, and I am the LGBTQ Health Initiatives Manager for Public Health Dayton and Montgomery County. And I'm also the board chair for an organization called Rainbow Elder Care of Greater Dayton, which works to help improve the lives of older LGBTQ adults in our area. I am also a 32-year HIV thriver. In November, it will be 32 years since I learned that I had HIV. So I have quite a bit of lived experience through some of the things that we're going to be talking about today. Zach, if you could give me the next slide, please. I'm not driving today, Zach is, so occasionally you'll hear me ask him to advance the slides. And before we get started, let's talk a little bit about questions. If you would, please use the chat box for questions. That way we can take a look at them about halfway through and stop and take time to answer questions. And then we'll also do that again at the end of the webinar. So if you would, please use the chat box.
If I may add, for those who are just joining us on phone, if you could hold your questions till the time that we pause for questions or until the end. We want to make sure that you have the opportunity to ask questions if you'd like to as well. So, sorry, Jerry, I'll turn it back over to you.
That's fine. So the Ohio Health Modernization Movement is a coalition of organizations and individuals across the state of Ohio that have come together to work to end the criminalization of HIV in Ohio. And, our mission really is to form as broad a coalition as possible, including individuals like yourselves and communities, particularly in communities that are disproportionately impacted by HIV. And as some may know, there are some communities that are more adversely impacted, such as the African American community, women, men who have sex with men, particularly in the African American community and in the Latinx and Hispanic community. But what we're trying to do is replace the fear-based HIV laws that were passed back in the mid to early to mid 90s and replace those with evidence-based non-discriminatory laws that really are much better at protecting public health. And here you can see some of the organizations that are supporting this effort, along with the website for the Ohio Health Modernization Movement. You can see it here, it's ohiohealthmm.org. So you can go there to get more information, keep up with what we're doing. There are some other organizations that also are supporting the effort. Some are national organizations. So for example, the HIV Log Policy Center, as well as Lambda Legal. The ACLU of Ohio also is supporting this effort, and the Center for Community Solutions in Cleveland. So we have people from all over the state, as I mentioned, and we've been working in this most recent iteration for about 1.5 to 2 years. Next slide, please. So there's some real issues and problems with our current HIV criminalization laws. And I say laws because it's more than just one law. There are several laws that can come together if a person is arrested and charged and convicted under these laws, and that person could go to prison for up to 8 years for not disclosing their status to a sexual partner or during sexual conduct. Now, I'll say that Ohio is not alone in this. Ohio is one of 29 states that have specific HIV criminalization laws. Some other states have amended their laws, and we're trying to accomplish that in Ohio through this effort. The thing about the law really is that it's just unjust. As I mentioned, it has pretty steep penalty, and it's very broad in terms of how it defines sexual conduct. Zach will talk a little bit about that in a moment. But the point is really it comes down to criminalizing disclosure of one's HIV status. So as you can see here, it doesn't require that the virus was actually transmitted or that there was any harm done. It's really about whether or not a person discloses their HIV status, and they can prove that they disclosed it, and that the person to whom they disclosed it understood that they were disclosing it. And each of these cases is different, but at its core, it really is more about disclosure than it is about any harm being done through transmission of the virus. It's also unscientific. Again, as I said, these laws were passed in the 90s, most of them. And it was at a time when hysteria about HIV and AIDS was still rampant. And some of them were passed before there was something called HAART therapy, or highly active antiretroviral therapy. Oh, excuse me, I couldn't get that out. And really, that's what you would know today as drug cocktails that people living with HIV sometimes take that can suppress the virus to the point of being undetectable. And often if it's undetectable, then it can't be transmitted. And, as we know from current science and drug therapy and treatment protocols, HIV today is a manageable chronic condition. It isn't a death sentence like it was back in the early 90s before some of the current drug regimens and therapies were developed. And I would just want to point out that when I talk about drug therapy and drug cocktails and being undetectable, there is a phrase that you will hear in the HIV and allied community called undetectable equals untransmittable, or U equals U. And I just want to make you aware of that, because sometimes all of this discussion about being unscientific boils down into a phrase you may see occasionally called U equals U. Next slide, please. We also believe that our current laws are unproductive. They don't promote good public health. There's no evidence that these laws help prevent the transmission or spread of HIV. And because they stigmatize HIV unfairly, it can help spread the disease rather than prevent the spread of the virus. And so, for example, because disclosure is such an important aspect of our current criminalization laws, some people may decide not to learn their HIV status. They may not get tested or learn their HIV status, because that way they can't be held liable or found guilty or be arrested and charged for not disclosing something that they didn't even know about. And so there are lots of ways that this law can undermine good public health, because what we want is for people to know their status so that they can get proper care and we can help prevent the spread of HIV. But laws like this tend to undermine that effort. And you can see here that it's also not supported by some pretty important organizations. So you can see the ACLU of Ohio opposes it. The National Association of Criminal Defense Attorneys opposes it. I think the American Psychological Association opposes it. The American Medical Association opposes it. When I say oppose it, really what they are asking for is for these laws to be looked at and to be amended and updated in keeping with some of the recommendations that we have and that Zach will go through in a moment. Next slide, Zach. One thing I'll just add before I turn it over to Zach is, as he's going through this, I think it's important to note that, within our task force across the state of Ohio, the majority of the people on the task force, on the steering committee, as well as the subcommittees, like the legislative committee that both Zach and I are on, are comprised of a majority of people living with HIV or AIDS. We abide by the mantra of nothing about us without us. And so any decisions that get made by the steering committee or by the subcommittees are made with, by, and for, and led by people living with HIV. So I think that's an important thing to know about this effort as Zach steps us through some of the proposed changes. Zach.
Well, thank you, Jerry. And this is the time that we'll take to take in any questions about what Jerry has presented about thus far. So if you have any questions and you are on the video, you can go ahead and drop them in the chat. If you're on phone, go ahead and take yourself off mute, and we'll ask that we spend the next couple of seconds to 1 minute processing those questions. Okay, well, seeing as we have not heard from anyone, we will go ahead and proceed. A lot of what we are aiming to do today, our goal is to make sure that we're giving you an overview of some of the advocacy tools that this coalition has put together to help you be the best advocate for this community in this endeavor that you can be in front of policymakers with which you may be interacting. This group has come together over the past couple of months and couple of years to really make sure that we're refining our advocacy approach for probable legislation that we hope to have introduced by the end of the year that takes a look at Ohio's laws. And we have isolated the 6 statutes, and we're finding ways that we can, and we're offering recommendations. A bill has been drafted by our Chief Public Policy and Strategy Officer at Equitas Health in concert with this organization, with this coalition, and it is being introduced to the Legislative Service Commission as well. So we're hoping that we will have a bill sponsor and be able to introduce legislation by the end of the year. And this toolkit that we're offering is a way for you as a community advocate, as a member of this coalition, to take that message and ask for a very specific policy outcome for your member of the Ohio General Assembly. So we will go through and we will talk briefly about this matrix that we leave in your packet, which gives a great synopsis of the current state of Ohio's criminalization laws, and then what we are proposing to amend in this piece of legislation. We'll also then walk through the ways that you can contact your state legislator. It starts with looking them up, and a few of the other opportunities that we have for you to engage moving forward. So first, let's go ahead and talk about what's on the slide right now. This is our proposed change matrix that's a leave behind in your folders, or in lieu of physical folders, will be made available in the forms of a digital folder through Google Drive. So this is really a great document that helps guide a conversation with either a legislative aide or the member of the House or member of the state Senate that you may be speaking with. there's a lack of information, or let's say a gap of information between what many policymakers may know about HIV and then also the science and then your own lived experience as well. So what we want to do, we want to educate, we want to highlight the importance of this issue by bringing it to their attention through conversation, and then highlighting our proposed fix and moving forward with a very specific ask. And that ask is going to be either for co-sponsorship or general support of the bill. So to guide your conversations, we have provided this matrix. You may not be able to read line by line from this matrix when you meet with your policymaker, and I actually would recommend that you do so. This is a great tool, like I said, to guide the conversation and then to utilize as a leave behind for that staff member, that policymaker, to then digest some of the information that you're able to give in a quick 15-minute meeting. So as it states on the screen, for those of you who are joining by phone, I'll read a few of these so we can all see and all comprehend. We list what Ohio's current laws do or do not, and then we talk about our proposed changes to that law. So for example, do Ohio's current laws require state of mind? The current law does not require state of mind. Our proposed law would require that prosecution must prove that a person intentionally transmitted HIV to another person. That person is guilty of intentional transmission only if the person acted with a specific intent to transmit the disease to another person. A prosecutor must then prove that an individual had the specific intent in order to transmit to convict. So, like we said, Ohio currently doesn't require state of mind. Our proposed change would require intent. Our proposed change also requires proof of transmission as well. So we have to then show that the virus was transmitted from person A to person B in order to prove that there was some level of harm. So we're requiring intention, we're requiring proof of harm as well. It's also important to note that the current law doesn't take into consideration various risk reduction measures. Our proposed law does. So the proposed law will allow the use or attempted use of risk reduction measures, including condom use, barrier protection, prophylactic devices or medication, medical treatment regimens for people living with HIV to defend against prosecution. Additionally, our proposed change would remove HIV-specific felonies, so making all HIV-related offenses proportionate then to the harm. So that would eliminate specific felonies and then also make intentional transmission a misdemeanor level offense. So going over to the next slide, we're listing a few more areas that Ohio's law currently doesn't account for. So like we said, removing those HIV-specific penalties in the enhancement for sex workers. The current law doesn't account for that. Our proposed change would remove discriminatory penalty enhancement for sex workers living with HIV for the following offenses. So solicitation, loitering, to solicit, and prostitution. Our proposal also includes the removal of penalties for blood and organ donation for people living with HIV, and repeals the prohibition of such donation. What this piece of legislation is doing is, like we said, making sure that the law catches up to the science. That we're basing these laws off of current science and not stigma that was around at the height of the epidemic and currently still is because these laws exist. So this is not something that we encourage you to use as a talking point per se. Like, you're not going to go through line by line. It's just there to kind of give some high level tracking of changes from current law to proposed law. So like we said, that's going to be a leave behind in the packet that you will be receiving after this call, that you'll be able to receive in person the next time that we're all able to come back together again. But really, we want to start with guiding you through the process of how do you reach out to your member of the House and the Senate. For a lot of us who haven't worked in this arena before, who maybe haven't been to the State House, this can be an intimidating process, because you see state representative or state senator. These are people who campaign for office and can spend a considerable amount of their time making decisions that govern the everyday functions of our lives. What's important to really know is that, yes, there's a level of decorum that goes with contacting public officials, and there's a strategy behind, everything that our coalition is doing. There's a strategy behind passing and amending laws. But these people that you're speaking with are human. They could be your neighbor. You could run into them at the grocery store. They may have gone to school with you. You may have kids in the same grade. So they have very real concerns as well. And at the end of the day, they are also just people. So to demystify it, they're people, but they're also people who work for you. You put them in office, you elect them, and they are responsible to their constituents. So the first step in contacting your member of the Ohio General Assembly is knowing who they are. So once again, we know that they're a human, but we know that they're a human that is elected to represent us based off of the geographic area in which we live. So we've actually provided within this toolkit a link to help you identify who represents you in the State House and in the State Senate, because it's really important that you find the appropriate person to talk to speak to your constituency. So if you wanted to open up the link, I'll show you the website really quickly. We have both the House and the Senate district maps available on this webpage. And you can actually go down and search by address. I won't do that right now because I think a lot of us have used the search function before. So you can just put in your address, you can hit submit, and then it'll help you look up who your member of the Ohio General Assembly is. So when it pops up, you're able to see that person, a link to their webpage, which will have helpful information, their bio, where are they from, what committees do they serve on, press releases that they've published from their office, as well as pending legislation that they are either a sponsor of or a co-sponsor of. And so that's a great tool to kind of navigate, what is my policymaker doing? What is my member of the House doing? What committees do they work on? What issues do they typically see? It will also contain contact information. So you'll be given the email address and the phone number for their office here in Columbus. It's important then, once you've done a little bit of research, you read as much as you wanted to read about that individual, that you call the office or you send an email to the office and you ask to speak either with the scheduler if they have one or to the legislative aide. You'll want to introduce yourself as a constituent of that member's office by either stating your home address. And if you don't feel comfortable doing that, you can maybe just say the town. So for me, for example, I live here in Columbus. I'm represented by Kristen Boggs. If I wanted to schedule a meeting with Representative Boggs, I could just say, hi, I'm a member of her district. I live here in Columbus. If I wanted to, I could say, I live. Then you want to make the ask. You want to request a brief meeting, often being aware of their schedules. When the House and the Senate are in session, they have a lot of meetings. They're meeting with their committees, they're meeting with the caucus, they're meeting other constituents to talk about very important issues as well. So you want to make sure that the request that you make is brief. You don't want to ask for an hour or 2 hours of their time. You'll be more successful if you ask for a condensed window of time, either 30 minutes or 15 minutes to have your conversation. Let's say that maybe that legislator is booked for months. You can then ask if the legislative aide or the constituent aide or a policy person is available to speak with you as well. Oftentimes these people are going to be more effective in making sure that the member is informed than having the conversation directly with the member. So don't become disappointed if you don't have the opportunity to meet with the member directly. You are given to a staff person. So, in light of COVID, we're not sure. And obviously with schedules too, because in a typical election year, the General Assembly, members of Congress, they break, they go on a summer recess, which is typically pretty lengthy, so they could go campaign in their district. Knowing that things are changing, there's going to be this vacuum probably of in-person meetings. It's also appropriate to ask for maybe a phone conversation, and email is another great way to mitigate that as well. So as long as they're being responsive to you and you are able to kind of claim some space either through a digital or through a phone or an in-person meeting, we want to make sure that you have that opportunity. So speaking also to digital, a lot of our activity, this webinar is a prime example, has had to change given current circumstances. But even before that, we know that our policymakers had started to move a lot of their efforts to a digital space. Everybody has social media these days. I shouldn't say everybody, most people have social media these days, and we're on a variety of platforms. It's a great way for us to share information. Maybe you remember, I don't know, just any day over the last 3 years thinking about what this administration's doing. You probably found out about it through social media or through a news outlet that has a social media channel. What we want you to know is that members at the Ohio General Assembly also use social media. They're engaging with their constituents now through Twitter, through Facebook Live events, through Instagram stories, by posting on LinkedIn, and also by having teletown halls. So these teletown halls, these Facebook Live events, these social media channels are a great way for you to familiarize yourself with your member of the General Assembly. I recommend, after you've looked them up, check that bio to see if maybe they've linked back to their social media accounts and give them a follow. It's really important to know what they're doing on behalf of you and your community. I would make sure that you take a look at that. There's one caveat I would recommend right now as it relates to the efforts to modernize Ohio's laws, that we're not just going on a little tweet storm to our member of the House and to the Senate right now, telling them what to do. Once we have a bill introduced, once we have a sponsor, that's when we're going to be asking you to engage in a lot of digital advocacy and asking them to become co-sponsors. So until that ask is available, we ask that you just follow, you get familiar, you learn how your member or their staff really interacts in that digital forum, because it's a great way to just get to know somebody. And then when it's time, we'll make sure that we provide you an asset kit that can help shape the conversation and keep us all on track. All right. So the next, we're going to give an overview of our legislative advocacy toolkit. This is a great, I think, 2-page document. We'll pull it up in a second. We'll be able to look. That kind of gives a rundown of what these meetings look like. Obviously, they're going to be 15 to 30-minute conversations. We've covered that already. But we really want to hit some of the highlights that we believe make really effective meetings. So the toolkit, as we mentioned, is intended to serve as a guide for OHMM members and constituents and advocates who are meeting with Ohio's policymakers to discuss the importance of modernizing Ohio's laws as they relate to criminalizing people with HIV. So the toolkit provides a very cohesive guide to a successful introduction, how you identify the problem, how you share a story of harm if you have one, or share your own lived experience, maybe as a person living with HIV or working within a space or for an organization who cares for patients and clients living with HIV. But then we also make sure that we want to hone back into our proposed changes. We want to identify the solution. And then finally, we're going to make the ask when there is an ask to make. So I will pull that document up so we can kind of give you some sort of an overview. So we have 2 pages where we identified those 5 main areas. So like we said, you're going to make the introduction. You're going to introduce yourself as a constituent, hopefully, or you're going to introduce your organization as well. It's also helpful, you remember probably when Jerry went through in the beginning and listed some of the partner organizations for the coalition. So Equality Ohio, Equitas Health, Cleveland AIDS Task Force, CareCol. There are also other organizations who have been supportive in this process as well. And so the ACLU is a great example. You may know that your House or Senate member has a great relationship with one of these organizations, or maybe they have an office within that person's jurisdiction. And so you'll want to highlight that as well. So like we said, tailoring them can be advantageous. We're going to identify the problem. You can keep this short because like we said, you have those leave behinds that you can give to that member or to their legislative aid. So we're going to highlight the main problems here, right? The law is currently based in science. They do not promote good public health. Instead, they undermine it. These laws are unfair and stigmatizing. And finally, incarcerating people living with HIV is costly. Next is where we're going to share a story of harm. And so this is an area where we as a coalition are going to also be asking for your help in sourcing some of these stories of harm So if you know of somebody who has been prosecuted under any of these statutes, we ask that you contact us to let us know, or maybe encourage that individual or their support system to contact us. That way we can kind of bring together and show how and to what extent these laws are really harming everyday Ohioans. So it's really important that we source these stories locally. If you do not have a story of harm to share, we do ask that maybe you feel comfortable sharing your personal story. If you are a person living with or at risk of HIV, it's important to localize that as well. Next, we're going to identify the solution. We've outlined some of our proposals for you earlier, and like we said, you will have those either in digital or in print format, but we want to hit the highlights here as well. So we want to let our policymaker or our legislative aide know that our proposals are actually based in science and not in stigma. Our proposal requires intent of the alleged perpetrator. Our proposal also requires proof of transmission. And then finally, our proposal allows for a comprehensive affirmative defense. So once we've outlined our problem, our story of harm, and our solution, we're going to make the ask. So the ask being, when this legislation is introduced, or if it's already been introduced, will that member sign on as a co-sponsor, and will they, generally speaking, be supportive of the legislation? You can also use this time for them to ask any questions. Hopefully you're able to get some engagement from them and get to the point where they're willing to ask questions, because that's when it's going to be really impactful and really helpful. All right. So toolkit materials to help you guide your advocacy and your conversation. We already mentioned this matrix that you have down here, and we just went through the legislative toolkit document. So those are two pieces of literature that are going to be made available to you to be able to use in these conversations. Additionally, we're working to refine a FAQ section. So obviously the purpose of these webinars is to provide some training, but it's also great opportunities for us. These are great opportunities for us to kind of gather your feedback and take your questions, because the policymakers might be having similar questions, and really find a comprehensive way to answer those questions and do so effectively. We're putting together an FAQ document as well that will be made available to you. I will actually turn it over to Jerry as well to talk through some of the other toolkit materials and leave-behinds that we are making available.
Right. I don't have a lot to add here, except just to point out that as you look at your screen, what you see in the middle is an infographic from the American Psychological Association talking about why they oppose HIV criminalization laws. And it's good because they also mentioned several other organizations that also are at least recommending these laws be reviewed and amended and updated or oppose them altogether. And on the left side of the screen are just a couple of examples of some of the fact sheets that we have in the toolkit. These are only two of them. There are 2 or 3 others that basically parallel or communicate the same information that I went through when we started. So, you know, I think you see the one here that talks about that the laws jeopardize public health, discourage testing, etc. And then you can see the one in the lower left talks about that they don't adhere to current science or treatment protocols, and are basically, you know, outdated. And again, you can see the phrase that I mentioned, "you equals you." So these are just some of the materials that will be in the toolkit. It'll come together in a folder. You'll have a lot of the items that Zach just went through. We will be continually updating the FAQ as we get more questions and realize what additions we need to make. But we started out, I think, with about 6 questions so far. We had an earlier session today that we got a couple of good questions in from that session, so we'll try to add those into the FAQ. You know, back to Zach's point about sort of customizing the material based on your legislator. So, you know, before you would do a legislative visit, it's pretty important to know a little bit about them. Maybe what committees they're on, maybe would understand what some of their passions are in terms of legislation, things they really care about. So you might need to customize the toolkit a little bit to sort of address what their primary considerations or what's important to them. So in some cases it might be budget, so you might stress a cost message that these laws can be very costly, to prosecute and imprison people, but they don't really do that much good in terms of prevention, in terms of preventing the spread of HIV. So, you sort of need to figure out what's important to the legislator, and if you can, as much as possible, kind of tailor the message and adapt some of these tools toward that. So I think that's all I have to add on that, Zach.
Great, thank you. All right, and now we will move into questions. If anybody has them, feel free to drop them in the chat box. Or if you are on the phone, go ahead and make sure to unmute yourself and ask, and we will address those. And as we wait for the questions to roll in, I will point out that our contact information is on the screen for those of you who can see it. So we have phone numbers and email addresses up there as well. Feel free to reach out to us if you don't feel comfortable asking your question now, or maybe you're out walking the dog and a question pops into your mind later this afternoon or at some point in the future as well.
And you don't need to be frantically scribbling those. I'm going to leave the webinar open a little bit longer after we actually end so that you can continue to write things down. In addition, tomorrow morning, everyone who was either on the earlier webinar or this one will receive an email from me, which will have a link to that Google Doc, the Google folder where these documents live kind of live. I will also attach the static document in time to that email for those who cannot access Google Docs. So that I will also have the link to how to find your legislator and then contact information here as well. Do want to remind everybody that you don't have to do this alone, particularly if you have an electronic or digital meeting with a legislator. A member of the OHMM coalition would gladly support you in that and go with you if you reach out to us. I'm not seeing any questions yet, so I'm also going to note that I'm going to post right now for everybody a link to an evaluation for this webinar. I would love for you all right before you leave to click on that and move to that form to do an evaluation, but I will also include that link in the email that you will receive tomorrow.
Well, thank you, everybody. If there aren't any questions, don't be shy, though. If you have questions, you can still offer them. So. Right.
Awesome. Well, thank you for your participation and your interest today. It's encouraging to see so many people still be taking up this mantle as we navigate all of the craziness of our world right now. So we thank you for your time.